Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Here to make another video today about news that has surfaced about Ben Shapiro putting out a petition to pardon Derek Chauvin. Now, as you guys recall, Derek Chauvin was the individual, the cop, who was guilty of the murder of George Floyd. Yes, it was a murder. It was a racially biased murder, to be honest with you. We all saw it. The entire world saw it. There was no uh, qualms about it at the time. As a matter of fact, at the time, Ben Shapiro made a statement that he was in agreement. That, yeah, David, that he was in agreement with the conviction. Now he's switching stances. Now he says, Aaron Pritchard says that's a bad idea. Now Ben Shapiro says, "Dear President Trump, we write to urge you to immediately issue a pardon for Officer Derek Chauvin, who unjustly convicted and is currently serving a 22 and a half year sentence for the murder of George Floyd and associate associated federal charges. As you know, this was the inciting event for the BLM riots that cost $2 billion in property damage in cities across the United States and set America's race relations on their worst footing in recent memory. Yet the evidence demonstrates that that Derek Chauvin did not murder George Floyd. George Floyd was high on fentanyl and he had a pre-existing heart condition. He was saying he could not breathe before he was even out of the car. Derek Chauvin, for large segments of the widely circulated video of the encounter, had his knee George Floyd's neck, on George Floyd's shoulder and back, and not his neck. That was confirmed by the autopsy, which showed no damage to George Floyd's trachea. There was no accusation or trial that Derek Chauvin targeted George Floyd for his race. Perhaps most significantly, there was a massive overt pressure on the jury to return a guilty verdict, regardless of the evidence or semblance of impartial deliberation. The pressure took the form of threats, coercion, and intimidation. The mayor of Minneapolis prejudged the outcome of the trial and immediately issued a large settlement to the Floyd family. Then President Biden, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, and others prejudged the outcome. But anyway, basically, the trial and took the national media credit to pressure on the jury to go along with the preferred narrative. Under these circumstances, there was no opportunity for a blind judge to work, and a man is now rotting in prison because of it. Make no mistake, the Derek Chauvin conviction was the defining achievement of the woke movement in American politics. The country cannot turn the page on this dark, divisive, and racist era without righting this terrible wrong. Thank you for the commitment to ending the weaponization of the American justice system. This is bullshit. Uh, this is all bullshit. Okay? When this happened in 2020, everybody everybody was in agreement. We all saw the video. There's no conjecture here. There's no what ifs. We saw him get killed. Regardless, we can never know motives. We can never know if you targeted George Floyd because of his race. We can never know that for sure. That can't be proven. But what we can know is that a man was was supposed to be arrested for counterfeiting money, which George Floyd was supposed to be arrested for, and he ended up dead. That we can know. And because we can know that, we can know that Derek Chauvin acted in a racist manner. We can't know that he's racist, but he acted in a racist manner. So what does that tell you? If a person is shot and and another person is killed, if that individual says that he didn't intend to do it and it was an accident, but they have him on video actually pulling the trigger, does it matter the intent? No, because intent can't really be proven, can it? So, with that being said, all we know is the result. All we know that a father, a husband, a son, and a brother in George Floyd is dead. And that's all we need to know. As far as I'm saying it's a crowning achievement of the woke movement, bullshit. Okay? This had nothing to do with wokeism. This had nothing to do with all the things, all the conservative boogeymen that, I mean, all the liberal boogeymen that conservatives like to chant. um, present to us. There's nothing to do with CRT, nothing to do with wokeness, nothing to do with LGBTQ, nothing to even really do with racism. Take race out of it. You cannot really remove race because that was the context for the murder. Ask yourself, if George Floyd were a white man and he was convicted of the same exact crime, would they have used the same amount of force on him? Highly doubtful. You know, people want to point to egregious examples. People want to say, oh, well, these cops, you know, they're not in the KKK. They're not neo-Nazis. They don't have to be. We grew up in a system that indoctrinates us from day one to think in racialized terms. And in those racialized terms, we develop thinking. Now, individuals can break away from that. Individuals don't have to be indoctrinated by those racial stereotypes. They can learn to see other people as individuals, and not think of them in a racialized sense. But seeing as most people don't, we grow up with stereotypes and misconceptions in our minds about different ethnicities, and that allows us, when we're on our jobs and in professional places, to form preconceived notions about individuals. And cops do have preconceived notions in regards to African Americans, and that causes violent outbursts against African Americans, you know, by police. And that's why um, black people are disproportionately targeted by the police. Because let's face it, the way the nation was designed, I mean, you might not agree with BLM and everything, or even CRT and the way they look at history, but you cannot deny that the structures and systems in the United States, even though we've come a long way in improving relations and improving, you know, and reforming said system, the system was designed to keep black men and women out, and designed to target black men and women. Because this is why a thing like the 1619 Project, which Ben Shapiro is against, is totally important. Because kids of all races need to really learn what is the origin of this racial animus that exists and that permeates every aspect of American society. Where did this start? Who began it? Right? Why did it begin? That people say, oh, well, why talk about slavery? Slavery has existed in all societies in all times, right? Mm-hmm. But the particular type of slavery that existed in the United States was race-based. In other ancient, at least it's saying it's a bad idea. They want to start stuff. In other ancient societies, there were slaves. Yes, Rome had slaves. Greece had slaves. The ancient Hebrews had slaves. The ancient Egyptians had slaves. Africans had slaves. Every society has had slavery. Slavery has existed in every society. But was the designation between slave and slave master, was it a racial designation? No. The Romans were white people and they had white slaves. They had sometimes other Roman slaves. The Africans were black and they had black slaves. The Indians were Indian and they had Indian slaves. But in this society, in the United States, a slave wasn't a slave because he owed an economic debt or he was from a different nation that was conquered by another nation. A slave was a slave in this society, in this country, solely based on the color of his or her skin. And that was a permanent condition. That wasn't for a time, that wasn't for a little while, for 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, even 100 years. That was forever. And that's the difference. That's the difference between American chattel-based slavery and the kind of slavery that they like to compare it to in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and in ancient times. It was totally different. It was the first ever race-based slavery to ever exist, was the slavery in the New World that was imposed by Europeans. And then, okay, that lasts from 1619 to 1865. What happens after 1865? Are the former slaves and the former slave masters good with each other? No. Each and every milestone of progress that was achieved by the Black community during Reconstruction was immediately reversed in the 1870s at the end of Reconstruction. The Ku Klux Klan was allowed to put in politicians and reverse every single milestone that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution made after the Civil War. So that again makes it different than even the slavery that existed in Spanish countries in the Americas, in Latin America, for example, where after slavery was over in those countries, sure, slavery went on for a little while longer in those countries than in the United States. But, for example, in Brazil, it ended in the 1880s. But after that was over, the Black population and the white population in those countries were integrated with one another. Brazil is a highly mixed society. Cuba is a highly mixed society. The Dominican Republic, highly mixed society. It's Mexico, all these Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries. They had slaves as well, but their slave population after it was over was integrated into the society. Black Americans were not. Black Americans were segregated after slavery for over 100 years. And then, okay, let's talk about other things. During those times, even despite Jim Crow, that 100 years from the end of the Civil War to the end of Jim Crow, Black Americans tried to build up their own communities. Tulsa, Oklahoma, Ocoee, Florida, Rosewood, Florida, Elaine, Arkansas. And each and every time, these communities, not just Tulsa in 1921, but each and every community that I just named was completely destroyed by white supremacists. Each and every time. So even despite the odds that were put against them, Black people tried to do something for themselves economically, and they were denied that opportunity. So not only were they forcibly segregated by the rulings of Plessy versus Ferguson, but even in segregation, doing something for themselves, trying to achieve economic upward mobility, they were stopped. They were prevented from doing so. Okay? And you had experiments like the Tuskegee experiment that tried to literally exterminate Black men. You had instances where they tried to sterilize Black women to keep them from having babies, right? You had all this stuff happening, and all this was race-based because the society was shaped, whereas the white society was afraid of losing dominance. Even the beginning of the police department, before there were police patrollers, there were slave patrollers during slavery. It was designed to keep black men down, to keep the black society down, to keep them subservient. That was the main goal of white American society. They didn't want to see black people as equal, and they sure as hell didn't want to see them as superior. Okay, now people will say, "Oh, well, that's over with." 1965, 1964, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, it's all over with. But is it? Is it? Is it not? How can it simply be over with? How can we simply just get over that? There are people that are still alive on both sides. People that are still alive that protested against the integration of the schools in Arkansas and Louisiana after Brown versus Brown v. Board of Ed. People that black people as well as white people. So how can magically, just because a law is passed, the society be over something like that when we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years of oppression? Denied federal FHA loans for denial of federal FHA loans for housing, denial of Social Security for the first 20 years that Social Security existed. Black Americans were not eligible for Social Security, but still had to pay into the system being legally classed as citizens, but don't have the privileges of citizenship. Can't vote, can't collect Social Security, can't do any of that stuff. Can't even marry with whom you love because miscegenation laws were on the books. So you don't want us in your society to keep us segregated, but you don't want us to set up our own parallel societies, because as soon as we do and they're successful and prosperous, you destroy it. So what you really want is just us to be poor and destitute, and you want us to be subservient. And some of the more extremist white supremacists probably want us dead. You know what I mean? And they use crime as a pretext, because they'll say things like, "Oh, well, of course policing of black communities is disproportionate because they commit a disproportionate amount of crimes in the United States," failing to realize that most of the crimes committed are crimes of economic necessity, not crimes of racial bias. When you look at crimes from black to white, they're mostly crimes of economic necessity, because again, you set up these systems to block black Americans from both integration and economic prosperity. And then when they're poor and they act out because they're poor, because they're desperate and they want to make a way for themselves and their families, you then do shit like this. You do shit like Ben Shapiro, and you victim blame. George Floyd was a victim. George Floyd was murdered in cold blood on videotape. Lisa is absolutely right. This is a bad idea, and this will start things. And then they'll blame it on the black community. They'll say, "Oh, well, see, they're starting stuff just because we released Derek Chauvin." I don't think Trump is that stupid. I think one thing I like about Donald Trump is that he aims to be liked. You know what I mean? He aims to be liked. But then again, like I always say about him, he is easily persuaded. So if he's persuaded and he's getting to that point where he feels like, and tell me if you agree with this one, Lisa, he feels kind of like he's not trying to really get Democratic support anymore, because he feels like the Democrats don't like anything he does. He said that in the speech. So if he gets to that point and he allows extremists to sway him in some way, he may do something stupid like this. He may take it into serious consideration. Because he feels like, hell, they ain't giving me praise even though I tried. They ain't giving me praise. What he really needs to do, what he really should do, is talk about building up both parties should consider this, specifically building up economic initiatives within the black community as a form of reparations. You know, both parties should consider that. You know, even Kamala Harris kind of fucked up because, you know, when they asked her, you know, during the campaign, what would you do specifically for black people? She said nothing. You know, I mean, the Democrats, they want to do uh, a big umbrella, you know, plan that includes immigrants and trans people and other minorities, you know, like Hispanics and stuff. But these things didn't affect those communities. You know, those communities were not affected by the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. So how can you repair something that was never broken in their cases? African Americans and Black Americans and Black Americans and Black Americans only were the only people in this society that were brought here against their will and systemically denied access to the the fruits of this society that they put effort into and they build and they help grow. You know, they helped grow it militarily and they were denied access to it. They helped grow it economically and financially. And again, they were denied access to it. So they were the only group to do that. These other groups came from somewhere else. They came from another country or they happen to have a certain sexuality. They don't count. You know what I mean? African Americans and African Americans alone. I think that's where the Democrats go wrong. And the Republicans, half of them are outright racist, and the other half that ain't outright racist are totally oblivious or act totally oblivious and accomplices to the racism of the half that is racist. They act oblivious to the bias that American society has had for centuries against its black citizens. They act like it isn't there. You know what I mean? They want to throw Martin Luther King out to us every MLK Day, but they fail to realize one of Martin Luther King's initiatives that he never got passed, and Ben Shapiro should realize this because Ben Shapiro is the one always every MLK Day pretending like he's celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. But you can't just stop. You can't just stop at the at the speech. I have a dream speech. You can't just stop there. You got to go deeper. If you're going to study Martin Luther King, you have to go deeper into Martin Luther King and the things that Martin Luther King talked about, in specifically relating to economic justice. One of the things he said is you cannot release a people after centuries and centuries of injustice and indignation and expect them to achieve automatic economic equality. So he said, we're coming to Washington to get a check. You can't leave that part out. You can't leave out wealth distribution in regards to that. You know, that's an important part of Martin Luther King's platform. So you're going to praise Martin Luther King, you got to praise the real Martin Luther King, not the Martin Luther King you made up in your head based off one speech. Martin Luther King was not just for political and social justice. That was a start. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, that was the political part, but he was also for the economic part too. He was also against the economic disenfranchisement of black people, right? Not just the social and the political part. Conservatives want to stop at the social and political part and forget about the economic part because that makes them uncomfortable, because to them, that resembles socialism. But it's not socialism, guys. It is correcting a historic wrong that was done to a specific people. It's not a redistribution of wealth from those who have less, from those who have more to those who have less, simply because those who have more have more. But why do those who have more have more? Is it an imagined imbalance of power, or is it a legitimate imbalance of power that you can clearly look at history and base it off of? You can't compare it to socialism or Marxism because socialism and Marxism came out of the European milieu. It came out of the European cultural context. They didn't have in the European cultural context racism and white supremacy in the same way that we had, because how could they? They were a completely homogenous white society. You know what I mean? by comparison. So, and if Republicans are against that, conservatives are against that, people like Ben Shapiro, they shouldn't be. One of the things that have a problem with this is he goes back on his word. How are you going to say, and I hate that, guys. That to me is the biggest pet peeve. I talk about it a lot with a lot of other people. You know, uh, um, uh, Whack 100, the comments about Mexicans and other shit he said about other rappers and stuff. When people go back on their word and they say one thing and then they switch it around for political convenience to something else, I seriously hate that. I hate that. You know what I mean? So people like Ben Shapiro, that he used to say that it was wrong and that the conviction was correct, and now he says it isn't, simply because he feels like he's in a better position now to pander to Donald Trump because people are against the quote unquote wokeness. And I think that, like I said, the Democrats have a lot to blame with regards to being against quote unquote wokeness, and the BLM has a lot to blame for it. And I'm not going to say because of the violence, because I feel like, again, Martin Luther King felt. Martin Luther King was against violence, but he didn't demonize the people that committed violent acts because he understood that the violence is a symptom of their oppression. Violence is the rage of the unheard. Right? Rioting is the rage of the unheard. He understood it. He wouldn't agree with it, but he didn't demonize. So that's the way I feel. I don't necessarily agree with the violence that was done, but I understand why they did it, right? But he talks in the letter about $2 billion or whatever. How about the countless money and lives that were lost in all this stuff I talked about, from the transatlantic slave trade to the system of chattel slavery to FHA loans to blockbusting, redlining, debt peonage, all this stuff that existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, in that the system of white supremacy has wreaked upon the lives of Black people and only Black people in this country. What about that? Build trillions of dollars, right? So, and I think the people turned against the BLM movement, going back to that, and the wokeness, quote unquote, was because the Democrats tried to conflate too many issues, right? The BLM Democrats, they tried to combine things. You know what I mean? Like trying to equate different things. Every group has their own struggles, right? LGBT has their struggles. Disabled people have our struggles. Hispanics and immigrants and people like that, undocumented, they got their own struggles. But you can't conflate that with what we're talking about. You know what I mean? You can't make it like it's all the same thing and they all have the same historical experience, because that will turn people committed to certain struggles off. You know what I'm saying? Like when the Zionists talk about their struggles, right? You don't hear Netanyahu go, oh, well, see what we're going through in Israel and our attack by Hamas is the same thing that Ukraine and Zelensky went through. Because it's not the same thing. It's a completely different issue. So equating Black rights and BLM with trans rights and LGBT and having this big umbrella, that turns some people off. You know what I mean? Because it's like, what are you talking about? You're putting everybody under the same banner, and everybody doesn't have the same historical experiences. You know what I mean? Not to say that everybody doesn't struggle, because everybody struggles, but you can't say that it's all the same. Tell me what you think, Lisa. Where do you think that the BLM movement went wrong, in that people lost confidence in the BLM movement? Or did they? Do you think that Ben Shapiro is right, that people, like I was talking about with the Ukraine, go back to my video about Trump and Ukraine. You can lose the goodwill of the people. When something bad happens to you and people see it, right? You have a certain amount of sympathy and empathy from the general population. But if people feel like you've taken advantage of that and you overstepped that boundary, people will begin to withdraw their sympathy from you. You know what I mean? And a lot of people say that happened with BLM, that BLM had the sympathy of the people. People were on BLM's side after George Floyd happened. But then after a while, they lost it. After a while, people turned against it. And now Ben Shapiro is shifting his statement because he sees that the popular perception is that the mood of the society has changed. People are not so eager to support BLM anymore, just like Ukraine. At one time in 2022, people were eager to support Ukraine. Now they're not. And one time after October 7th, people were eager to support Israel, and now they're not. Do you think, Lisa, that happened with BLM? Do you think that BLM lost the sympathy of the people? After 2020, was it the violence or was it the conflation with other things? Or was it the mismanagement of funds by the BLM organization? That's another thing. Like there was a lot of fraud going on by the heads of the BLM organization. That were embezzling money and using the money to for their own goods and not really giving to the families of victims of police brutality, like Breonna Taylor or Sandra Bland or George Floyd or Eric Garner or Trayvon or any of these victims that we can name, Anton Sterling, Jacob Blake. The fact that we know their names is proof to you that it wasn't a real issue. It was real. And people that say it wasn't, that's bullshit, guys. You didn't have your eyes open. And how would and this is what makes Ben Shapiro so hypocritical, because how would Ben Shapiro like for me to say that October 7th wasn't real? That the pain of the hostages lost on October 7th, the Gaza attack, wasn't real? He would get offended by that. He would put me on the same level that he puts Kanye West, right, as an anti-Semite. I would never say that. But him saying that, how would he like for me to say that the people, the Hamas people, the Hamas members that perpetrated the October 7th attack, should be released from jail, right? He would call me a monster for saying that. He would call me an anti-Semite for saying that. So he wants to be able to say this and put out this petition and not be called a racist, right? And still take the side of being pro-Martin Luther King. So what, you're pro-Martin Luther King? Martin Luther King has been dead for years, right? Honoring a ghost is not going to give you any brownie points. You need to honor the man while he was here. And what were conservatives saying when he was alive? I don't care if they were, here comes the brigade that's going to say, oh, well, that was the Democrats. The Democrats have always been the party of the KKK. Bullshit. Bullshit. Because you could walk around in today's modern society, you can walk around anywhere in the world, anywhere in the United States, not necessarily the world, right? Because this is not relevant to the world. These things are not relevant necessarily to the entire world. But you could go anywhere around the United States and ask 10 people, how do you feel about the Confederate flag? How do you feel about the Southern cause? Why the South seceded from the Union? And I can guarantee you, I can 100% guarantee you that in 2025 AD, those people that support the Confederate flag, that support the Southern cause, that support conservative movement, and even support Donald Trump, I can guarantee you those people will 100% be Republicans. And then you could go around to another group of 10 and ask them how do they feel about racial justice? How do they feel about movements like BLM? How do they feel about the union cause? Or not necessarily the union cause, but the cause of abolition, the cause of desegregation, Abraham Lincoln, MLK, Malcolm X, and these other black figures, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, how do they feel about them? And I can guarantee you those that rate this, those figures and those positions, those historical positions as positive, I guarantee you that in today, 2025, those people would be Democrats. Maybe in the past it would have been flipped because that's evidence of a party switch. I mean, how do people not get this? That argument is so fallacious. Of course, there was a party switch. People say, oh, no, there was no party switch. So why do you care so much about being able to wave the stars and bars? Why was there a riot in 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia? Were the people in Charlottesville that were pro the statue of Robert E. Lee, were they Democrats? According to you and your fallacious argument and your ahistorical argument, they were because Democrats were the party of the KKK. Yet the people that supported Trump, saying they were good people on both sides, they seem to be all Republicans, right? Including Trump. So what am I missing? If there was no party split, explain that. You can't because there was a party switch. Would you, if you were to take the American Revolution, for example, right? If you were to take the American Revolution and look at the political positions of the people of the American Revolution, you know the conservatives of that time, of the 1770s and the 1780s, were the people that were loyal to King George III. And the liberals at that time were Thomas Jefferson, especially Thomas Paine, James Madison, James Monroe, the founding fathers, and to a certain extent, John Adams and George Washington, even though they were like on the more conservative end for the Americans. They weren't conservative by comparison to the Brits and the Loyalists, because the Brits and the Loyalists were for staying as a part of England, as a part of the 13 colonies of England, whereas as Jefferson and Washington were for a gradual reconciliation or a gradual independence, and treaties with England after the war, as opposed to treaties with the more radical of the French. So that was conservative and liberal during that time, during the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Then conservative and radical took a conservative and liberal and radical took on different meanings later on with other historical arguments. So you can't just say, oh, well, they were always Republicans or they were always Democrats. They had different labels, sure, but they had different, we're talking about not labels, but we're talking about political ideals and political ideologies. The conservative ideology has always been the same. If that were the case, if you're going by that, then Ben Shapiro shouldn't honor MLK. He shouldn't honor MLK, because MLK, they say, oh, MLK was a Republican. No, he wasn't. He was a preacher who took no political stances. And when he finally did take a stance in 1964, it was against Barry Goldwater. And Barry Goldwater was what? A Republican. Exactly. So that argument is dead. But the point is, if people like Ben Shapiro were alive during MLK's time, he would have been against MLK. If if you were alive during Abraham Lincoln's time, you would have been against Abraham Lincoln. Hell, if he were alive during the time of George Washington, as proud as he is to be an American, he would have been against George Washington because he was a conservative. A conservative believes in everything old is good. They're grounded in tradition. And when your traditions are, I mean, Ben Shapiro in the past has defended the Dred Scott decision. He has defended Judge Taney's position on Dred Scott of 1857, which is the most explicitly racist ruling in American history, other than Plessy versus Ferguson, in my opinion. It was that ruling that really pushed it over the edge for the abolitionists to want to abolish slavery, because they figured, hey, even if a black person is in a non-slave state, they're still subject to the South's rule. And Ben Shapiro supported that. So what does that tell you? Ben Shapiro is a militant racist. Ben Shapiro hates blacks. He hates black people. You can tell. You can tell by the contempt that he has for rap music. And and this is particularly evident, in my opinion, when he speaks about music. Because pay attention to not what people say, but what they don't say. When he speaks about music, right, he says that music started off here on a grand level. Right, and it degraded down from classical music to jazz, then from jazz to rock and roll, then from rock and roll to hip hop. So what is he basically saying? What he's saying is that the greater the influence of African Americans in black culture in the music, the worse the music is, in his opinion. Because you have classical music, which is lily white music, which is music that comes out of Europe, which is exclusively white. He considers that the best. Then you have jazz music, which is heavily African American influence, was invented by black people, was a symbol of pride of black society, but is in today's world associated largely with whites because whites co-opted it and took it over. So he considers that better, but there's still a large amount of black influence. Then there's a greater amount of black influence via the blues and rock and roll, so he considers that a downgrade. And then finally the hip hop, which is predominantly black and is the ultimate expression, the culmination, in my opinion, of the black American musical experience. He considers that the worst. So he considers that the polar opposite of classical music. Now, what would make rap the polar opposite of classical music? Given that, as well as Ben Shapiro's other opinions, like his support of Judge Taney's decision in Dred Scott, and his petition now that he's just put out, what can you deduce from that? You can deduce that the man is a racist. That he anything is. And I got his book on TV. He has a book on television where he analyzes everything from a conservative perspective, conservative political and social perspective on TV, every popular show. You know how many black shows are represented in that? Zero. Goose egg. Zero black shows are talked about. No Good Times, no Martin, no What's Happening, no Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, no Cosby Show, nothing. No Family Matters, nothing from the black American experience. And when he analyzes movies, except to deride historical movies that have to do with the civil rights movement, does he ever mention Black Panther? No, he derided it as a bad movie. He considers Hamilton a disgrace to American history. Why? I mean, just listen to the man's commentary. He's a racist. Would he burn a cross on somebody's lawn? I doubt it, because he's Jewish and they won't accept him, right? But he doesn't like black people. He despises black people. You know, you can clearly see it in the way that And Charlie Kirk is another one. They cover it up by saying, "Oh, we're not talking about race. We're just talking about, you know, economics. So we're just talking about culture, right? The culture wars." But okay, you're just talking about that. But how come everything that is bad in the culture, quote unquote, derives from the black experience in your mind? How come you've never taken a position of a black person over a white person? In fact, he's taken the positions of immigrant Muslims that he also despises. But if it's an argument between, and I've seen him do this, between a Muslim non-black a non-black Muslim person like a Pakistani or an Arab and a black person, he will take the side of the Pakistani or the Arab over the black person just to avoid taking the side of said black person. And we see this with racists all the time, especially when it comes to the sport of boxing. We see this a lot with the sport of boxing. You'll have people that are the most against immigrants, really racist against Hispanics and what have you, or Filipinos in the case of Manny Pacquiao. But when it's a fight between a black fighter, particularly a successful one, let's say Shakur Stevenson is fighting like Ryan Garcia, right? The conservative will always take the side of the non-black person over the black person. Now, that not racial preference? You know, anti-black racial preference? Of course it is. And Ben Shapiro does that in the political discourse. I've never seen Ben Shapiro take the side of a black person, unless it's a black person like Candace Owens. But again, Matt Walsh has isolationist views. Matt Walsh on the Daily Wire doesn't believe that the U.S. should intervene in Israel's war, right? He doesn't believe in the direct engagement of Israel. He's an isolationist Republican, right? Republicans that I agree with on foreign policy because isolationist Republicans. I despise the interventionist Republicans and the neocons. Like Lisa said, I was taken up for Trump with the Zelensky thing, but why was I taken up for Trump? Because I like Trump's stance on foreign policy. I think he may be being influenced by some of the neocons in his cabinet to go to war in Gaza, and I'll make a video about that later in a separate topic. But my point about Ben Shapiro is that Matt Walsh is another commentator on the Daily Wire. He's an isolationist. He's not necessarily in support of Israel, but he didn't ostracize her in the way he did Candace Owens, did he? The man is clearly a racist, and the man is clearly anti-black. I mean, everything about him screams that he's anti-black. Everything about him when he's involved with a black person shows that his uncomfortability and this hatred and disdain for black people and black culture and black people with dissenting opinions, even if they're conservative dissenting opinions like Candace Owens. He still didn't allow her a platform, but he allows other white conservatives with anti-Israel platforms on his. He defended Elon Musk's Nazi salute. This guy, a Jewish person, defended Elon Musk's Nazi salute, but threw Kanye under the bus. So it's okay for Elon Musk to do a Nazi salute and disrespect Jewish people and disrespect your own ancestors, Ben, because he's white, right? But it's not okay for Kanye West to do it because he's black. It's either okay or it's not okay. There shouldn't be a color distinction, but there is in the mind of Ben Shapiro because he's racist. I don't get why people don't see that. The guy is clearly, he dislikes black people. You know what I mean? You can clearly see it in every comment that he either makes or doesn't make. But anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Love you guys. Thank you, Lisa, Aaron, and David for contributing.